Hi everyone, welcome to episode 25 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. In this episode, I interview Alan Jones. Alan is a startup evangelist at Blue Chilli, an angel investor, and a founding investor in Startmate and Blackbird Ventures. Prior to these roles, Alan was Yahoo's second employee in Australia and a founding member of the local management team. He worked with Yahoo to localise US online consumer products for Australia and New Zealand, as well as planning product strategy and managing the product development. In the interview, Alan shares his insights on understanding customer intent, the ingredients of a good startup team, and the need to hack diversity. Without further ado, here is my interview with Alan Jones. Hi Alan, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks for having me, Rohit.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, can you share a little bit of your story and what got you here today?
I'm very old. I think that's important to get out front. So I'm 51. So I had a whole career in tech journalism before there was an internet. And when the internet came along, early websites were a lot like the layout and production of magazines, and that was the industry that I was in. So I thought that perhaps the World Wide Web would be higher margin work and less competition. And so I moved across to that and became what we used to call a web producer. So my first startup ideas went on to become parts of the local version of the 9MSN network back in the early to mid 90s. And then I took what I thought at the time was a huge risk and left to join a little Silicon Valley startup which was looking to find a way to bring the Yahoo brand out to Australia. And so I was an early hire at Yahoo and had a tremendous 7 years there learning and growing with that business.
Fantastic. So in terms of your experience with Yahoo, you mentioned that you were there at a relatively early stage. What was it like in growing a company that wasn't as well known to obviously the juggernaut that it is today, and being part of the really fast growing culture that they would have had at that time?
Yahoo was early to the rest of the world. So Yahoo was one of the first internet businesses to realize that the internet was going to be big in markets outside of the US. And because it was a small company and had only so much venture capital backing behind it, it had to try and find a way to scale into international markets as quickly as possible. It looked for markets where internet growth was rapid and said, what's the leanest way that we can get out into that market? And so the leanest way to begin with was to do a joint venture with a local media company or a local telco. So you either got content and an existing audience, or you got distribution if you had a telco as a partner. So Yahoo rolled out first in Canada, UK, and Japan, and they were all partnership models. Yahoo tried to do a partnership model in Australia, but the negotiations fell through with the partner at the last moment, and so in the end, Yahoo trusted a handful of people who'd been involved in that discussion to do a wholly owned version of Yahoo for Australia. And it was as an example of how startup thinking it was at Yahoo back in those days. They gave us 6 weeks. They wired enough money to us so that we would have enough money to set up our own servers, because in those days there was no cloud, so you had to own your own physical servers in a co-location facility. So they gave us enough money for that, and they said to my co-founder, they said, Tony, you've got to go out and sell 10 ad buys, 12-month ad buys to big Australian brands in banking, insurance, travel, etc. Right? So he was selling in 6 weeks. He had to get people to agree to a 12-month ad buy, probably their first ever internet advertising. We couldn't tell them how many impressions they were going to get, because there was no Australian Yahoo we had no stats, and we certainly couldn't tell them how many click-throughs they were going to get. But more importantly, that most of them and their agencies were pre-digital at that time, and so we had to educate them all about internet advertising. We had to show them how to repurpose something in graphics for print and repurpose that in the tiny little GIFs that we use for internet advertising in those days. So we had 6 weeks, and so my responsibility was to get a local version of the Yahoo content up and running. So Yahoo directory, some editorial content, some content partnerships, and we only just made it. And in fact, I think, if you'd run it as a scientific experiment and had us run through that 6 weeks period, maybe 20 times, I think, we would have only been successful one time, because there were so many different ways that could fail. We were just lucky that it was that one time, the one time we got was the time that we succeeded. And I think if you look back through the journey of many successful tech startups with an objective realist's hat on, you'll see that same kind of behaviour. I think one of the flaws in the tech startup industry is too often the original founders of a successful startup will look back at their journey and say, oh yes, I always knew that we were going to need to do this, solve this problem for that customer, and that we would move through the difficult transition phases by doing the following things. I think a lot of the time they're rewriting history, and if they were really truly honest about it, they would admit that we had no idea what we were doing. We just put it all on black, or we were pretty convinced that this was going to fail, but we had no other choice but to try.
So one of the things that you mentioned was selling into a company that wasn't familiar with the product that you were trying to sell them. And I'm sure that there are a couple of listeners here who are in a similar stage where they've got a new product that they're trying to sell into corporate or into different clients. How do you overcome that barrier of people and get them to believe in what it is that you're trying to sell?
I would say, wherever possible, avoid doing startups where you have to teach your customer why it's important they use your product. Ideally, if you can, you want to try and get in at the inflection point when all of the potential customers in your marketplace have recognized that they have a problem for so long, and that the existing solutions to those problems aren't working, so that when you knock on the door and show them your product for the first time, they're at least ready to sign up for a free trial or for a monthly subscription on a reasonable basis. Because most startups aren't set up to fund the education process for clients. That's typically not how venture capital works. There are exceptions to that rule. There's exceptions to every rule in startups, but you want to try and find your inflection point so that you're out to market just when customers are desperate to try a new solution. So oftentimes, successful founders are solving a problem that they've experienced themselves in an industry from which they've come from or worked in, and that's, I think, not a necessary prerequisite, but a really useful one to have. And then I think the third prerequisite is when you go back to all the other potential customers in that market, they're prepared, to put a $50 reservation to be one of the first 5 customers to use that product when it's ready. That's a sign that this is now the time to enter that market. Because when you go out and you pitch to people and say, look, we're working on this product, it's going to be in private beta soon, we'd love to have you, as a user, would you be interested in that? 90% of the time they'll say yes, and that bears absolutely no relation to whether or not they'll actually become a paying customer of that product. There's a massive difference in people wanting you to be successful because you're on an entrepreneurial journey right now, and everybody loves entrepreneurial journeys, and Australians don't like to say no anytime they're offered something for sale. And so if somebody can finish this meeting and it's all roses, and I don't actually have to pay any money until sometime in the future, then I'm going to do that. So you can't take that as a realistic intent to buy. I guess the other way to solve that problem is with landing page growth hacking exercises here, where you're running an A/B testing platform, and you've got something that looks very much like a service, which is nearly ready to go, and you're offering some price points and some feature set there so that potential customers can see that. You're advertising it on Google or Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and these people are coming through, and you give them a button to say sign up now, say for instance. And if they click on that button after they've seen all of your features and after they've seen some pricing information from you, you can take that as a pretty strong intent to purchase. It's not 100% certain, but it's a lot more certain than sitting in a meeting with a law firm and saying, if we finish building this product, would you be one of our first private beta customers?
Absolutely. Again, one of the things that you kind of mentioned was, playing in a market where your customers understand the pain point and the current solution's not really providing them the response that they really want. I think in one of your recent blog posts, you mentioned about being 10x better than the competitors. Can you explain why it's important to be 10x better than the other competitors in the space?
I think I first heard the 10x better rule from Mick Lebinskis when he was back at Pollenizer, and he's always been somebody that has been an inspiration and a source of new knowledge. And it's a rule of thumb. It's not a golden rule. Maybe 5x is better. Certainly 100 times or 250 times is better. And how you measure it is obviously very difficult. But people behave irrationally when they make purchase decisions, right? I'm a huge fan of the field of study called behavioral economics.
So am I.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And behavioral economics is all about designing experiments to observe how people actually behave in transactional situations. And again and again and again, we see irrational behavior when people come to purchase. So say, for instance, if I'm in the market for a new car, I'll go and read reviews and I'll talk to other people who own that car. And then I'll go and do some test drives, and I'll kick the tires at dealerships. And then I'll make up my mind, okay, I want a Toyota Corolla with this spec package. And then I go out to actually place an order on a car, and I come back from the dealership with, a high spec version of the car, or perhaps, a competing model from. And why did that happen? It's because at the actual moment of purchase, we switch from being that rational fact-finding, let me look at all the comparative reviews kind of people, to this is a major decision and it's going to reflect a lot about me as a person. And so my purchase decision now moves from being rational fact-based to emotional and personal identity-based. My hypothesis is that a lot of software as a service products and a lot of apps get purchased because people are unhappy emotionally at the time of purchase, and they're looking to fill in that time. They're looking to make progress towards making them feel less empty and unhappy inside, and they click on an ad that they see on Facebook, and 2.5 minutes later they've backed something on Kickstarter, or they've signed up for a new gym membership online, or they're seeking to solve deep emotional needs as much as they are trying to help their professional services firm reduce its cost of compliance.
Sure. On that, have you seen any really interesting examples by startups where you think that they've applied behavioral economics to gain additional traction or to gain, additional sort of exposure for their product?
It's always difficult to come up with concrete examples, but one very interesting example I remember from the last few years. There's a Melbourne-based startup in which I'm an investor called Macropod. And the Macropod guys have a product called BugHerd, which is used for bug testing, and it's a software as a service tool that's sold into digital agencies and people developing web-based apps. And the standard hypothesis for these kinds of products is you price them by having pricing. Here's our pricing page and here's our pricing table, and there's a free trial version that maybe is feature limited or user limited, or perhaps expires in 30 days time, and then you can choose your paid version that you want to upgrade to, right? So that's the orthodox approach. Macropod weren't happy with the conversion rate they were getting from free trial to paid. In fact, if they could see that if they continued offering all of their potential users a free trial, they were going to run out of the churn rate was way too high. And so they took what they felt was probably a huge risk and took the free trial version away. So they were risking their conversion from visitor to free trial, and they were taking a wild gamble on the possibility that it might influence their paid conversion, and it did. So a traditional economist would say, to prove the utility, give somebody a free trial for a period and then encourage them to convert. And if they convert, it's a sign that you are delivering sufficient utility. A behavioral economist looks at that experiment and says, interesting, when we took the free trial away, more people signed up for the paid plans. Why is that so? What can we test around that? So Macropod were able to fiddle with the different paid plans that they offered, and were progressively able to increase their average revenue per customer per month by actually making some of their offerings more expensive. And the best hypothesis, the best theory around why the taking away the free trial actually improved the conversion to paid was that sometimes people place an implied value assumption on a product or a service. And if you're giving away a free trial of it, that can sometimes make the purchaser consider, well, perhaps there isn't all that much utility in this product, despite the marketing claims. Why would they offer it to me for free for 30 days if it was really as good as they say?
Sure. And in terms of those marketing efforts, again, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was, sometimes people just get lucky in terms of the strategy that they use to go out. When you have limited resources, is there a way that you sort of suggest with the companies that you work with through Startmate or Blue Chilli, where they can test multiple different sort of traction channels or multiple different sort of marketing tests without having a lot of resources behind them?
So the traditional engineering-led to tech approach to developing tech startups is you build a product first. We use customer research, but you build a product first and then you take it to market and see what kind of adoption it gets and what sort of price point you can defend. The lean startup methodology approach is first go and market it, see if you can sell it, and in the process of marketing and selling it, you will learn enough about the product to determine what it is that you should actually build. And I think actually the truth there is somewhere in between those two approaches. You need to be inspired by a core assumption around the problem that you're solving and who the customer might be. But you need to be agile enough to go, nope, that hypothesis was invalidated. Next hypothesis. And you need to have a team which is prepared to go along that journey, investors prepared to go along that journey and have enough runway to be able to do that several times in a row. It's difficult though, because I think another important factor in the success of a startup is that you really care about the problem that you're solving and care about the customer you're solving it for, So say for instance, you get involved in the custom manufacturer of finely manufactured goods, and say for instance you are an athlete and you start up making custom soccer boots for soccer players out there, high net worth soccer players that want to have a soccer boot that looks like nobody else's, right? And you may find through several pivots that you end up making custom handbags for women, right? So there's a question there, do I really care about solving that customer problem, even though it's clearly a much more lucrative one than making custom soccer boots? And so that's a potential opportunity there to bring in other co-founders, and perhaps you take a back seat or step out of the startup altogether if it ends up solving a problem that you no longer care about. But you've got to be prepared to start out with, this is something I really care about, a customer I really care about, a problem I've experienced myself, and then be open as a team to go through several hypotheses to finally find a viable customer problem solution set.
Sure. And as I mentioned, among other things, you're kind of involved with, you're one of the early founding investors in Startmate, and also involved with Blue Chilli, obviously, where you see from both sides a lot of different startups and a lot of different founders come and apply to you. What are some of the commonalities that you see between good founders that you decide to end up working with?
That's an ever-evolving hypothesis as well. So Startmate is inspired by successful accelerator programs in the US, and its goal is to so the central hypothesis is, for most startups, their biggest marketplace is going to be the US, where there are more businesses and more consumers than anywhere else who are used to buying things online. So let's take really great startup ideas from Australia and take them to the US as quickly and as cheaply as possible, and help them with all of the things that we've all learned as mentors about how to take a startup from Australia to the US. The Startmate model hypothesis works, generally speaking, because we're looking for companies that will have a happiest home with a primarily US domestic customer base, but also a business which can go global from day one, so no significant regulatory barriers or economic barriers or cultural barriers that might prevent it being successful everywhere at once. Startmate also looks for people, for teams in which there is a strong technical co-founder or co-founders, and generally speaking, A Startmate team needs to be 2 to 3 people, ideally not 1, ideally not 4 or 5, because solo founders are a risk because the entrepreneur journey is a hazardous one, and you get kind of bipolar, because there are days when you're convinced you're going to rule the world, and then there are days that you're convinced that it's all been a horrible mistake. So having a co-founder or co-founders helps you moderate those highs and lows. But having a team of 5 or 6 people means the communications burden is so great, especially when you're a democracy and everybody has an equal say in the decision making, that teams of 5 or 6 tend not to succeed. I guess probably the most important thing, and I was talking to Nick Crocker about this earlier today, is that Startmate is also prepared to break all of those rules in order to get awesome founders with a great idea into the Startmate program. And so many of Startmate's successes are evidence of that, and many of the Startmate partners and Startmate mentors are an example of that. So Holly Karju, for instance, tremendous startup founder and now a member of the Startmate partner network. So Holly's a non-technical founder. She when she first got started, couldn't write a line of code herself. Still certainly wouldn't advertise herself as a software engineer if she had to go and find more work. But she's learned around that problem, and she brings a whole bunch of other skill sets around managing teams and managing people, finding a good customer problem set to solve for. And there are, there's a preference in Startmate for software as a service startups that can sell directly to businesses online, but there are some of the strongest companies in the Startmate portfolio are actually startups that sell into enterprise. So startups like UpGuard, like Propeller Robotics, like BugCrowd, they're all selling into enterprise with a sales team. So Startmate's ready to break the rules for the right founders and for the right product ideas. Blue Chilli is a new kind of accelerator program, which works primarily with non-technical founders. So in the past, if you're working in a profession and you're thinking about a problem that your profession faces, and one morning in the shower, a light bulb goes off above your head and you realize, you could solve this problem with something in the cloud or an app, and then you have this, but I'm never going to become a great software engineer, and I don't have any nerdy friends. How could I get this made? You can go to a digital agency and pay maybe $500,000 to get something built, or you can go to endless meetups in your local startup community and try and find a technical co-founder that might be prepared to come and join you on the journey. But choosing your own technical co-founder is like perhaps choosing your own neurosurgeon. If your GP said to you, you need neurosurgery, and you need to make the choice. You need to go and find your own neurosurgeon. I'm not going to refer you to anybody. You go out there and maybe you talk to a friend who'd had neurosurgery recently, and you say, was it a good outcome? And they would say, well, I was under general anesthetic for most of the time, but when I woke up, my arms and legs still worked. So I guess I had a good outcome. Or they would say, I was under general anesthetic, and when I woke up, I had this weird twitch in my arm, which has never gone away, right? So I hate that guy, So those sorts of binary evaluations. So if you talk to somebody who's a non-technical entrepreneur, or somebody who's worked with a digital agency or a software foundry who've built software for them, you'll typically get those same kind of reactions from them. I don't know, when they were working on it, it was all just lines of code flashing past, it gobbledygook to me. I got no idea what they're talking about. When it was finished, one person will tell you it did exactly what I wanted and it arrived on time. Another person will tell you, well, I used the same people, but my project took twice as long and twice as much as I expected, and I'm not happy with the product. How can you get those same outcomes from the same provider? It's very, very possible. So Blue Chilli exists to be the early stage technical co-founder for the startups in our portfolio. And our goal is to work with the founders to build a minimum viable product or a commercially viable product that allows us to validate the hypothesis around the business in order to raise capital from investors. Once we help the startup raise that seed capital, then it's time to start recruiting everything else and everybody else that startup might need. And some of those people will probably be technical talent. So Blue Chilli is there to make a smooth transition from a Blue Chilli-led product team to the startup's own product team over time. And it's very much in our interests to make that a smooth and beautiful transition, because our reward for doing what we do is a minority equity stake in the startup. And so the only way for us, for that to be worthwhile for us, is to make that stake in the company worth more. So we're with the founders of the business in making the business more and more valuable over time, so that it can provide a return to its shareholders, majority being the founders and also us.
Sure. One of the things that you mentioned about people looking for technical co-founders specifically is, they'll go along to meetups, as you mentioned, and essentially the first person that says yes, they'll bring them on. And as you mentioned, non-technical co-founders don't really know what to look for in technical co-founders. Is there, for people that are kind of in that stage at the moment, is there something that you recommend that they should look for or use to help them make a better judgment on who they should bring on? Yeah,
so I would say there's a massive difference between a software engineer and a technical co-founder. Yep. So if your business is successful, you might one day have 50 or 60 software engineers working for your business, and only one of those is a technical co-founder, and perhaps none of those, in fact. So the technical co-founder of a good technical co-founder of a startup is a business partner, is a peer in terms of their high-level view of the industry that you're working in terms of their ambition and their commitment to the business, and in terms of how much they can add, not just to the code base, but also to the relationship with investors and with employees, with the team that they manage. And you just don't find that just anywhere. And it's possible for somebody who is a software engineer employee to become a technical co-founder in the future, but it's a calling, and not all are called, and not all who believe they have what it takes actually will get there. So I would recommend bringing early technical hires on as employees, and if it's necessary to give them an equity stake in the business, then you should come up with a vesting schedule so that they earn into their equity over time as they prove that they really know how to do what they can do. And then at some future date, then you want to evaluate them for their capacity to be a technical co-founder.
Sure. So again, for people that maybe aren't as familiar with vesting schedules, it's essentially giving them the equity over time. Is that the right way to put that?
Yes, that's right. So when you take out a mortgage to buy a home, so you start with equity 0, bank, or equity 5% or equity 8%, and you earn your way back into the rest of the equity in the home by paying the bank back the principal and the interest. So when you have a vesting schedule for your founder equity, you have an agreement with a company that says, I'm going to perform the following duties for the business over the next 2, 3, 4 or 5 years, and as long as I continue to perform those duties to the satisfaction of the board of the company, I'll gradually earn that equity back in the business. So you know how much equity you're going to have at the end of that period, and you know the schedule on which you're going to earn that, and you know the duties that you have in order to continue to earn that. And that way, if your startup journey changes at some point in the future, and oftentimes it does, then when it's time for you and the startup to part company, then it's clear how much equity in the company you have already vested, how much of the company you already own. Then it's only necessary to negotiate, well, does the company buy that equity back from me, or do I remain a minority shareholder in the company? It's a really, really good discipline for all of the early hires in the company, even the founders themselves. If you and I had been great friends for 5 years, and we had spent the last 2 years talking about doing the next startup together, and both of us had a really clear idea in our heads of what it was we were going to do, and what you were going to do, and what I was going to contribute, even then it's a really good idea to have a vesting schedule, right? You or I might have a relationship breakup that just hits our productivity for a period of time. You or I might have a child, or need to travel overseas for an extended period to take care of a loved one, or have a nervous breakdown or a serious physical or mental health issue to resolve. It's not fair to the company for the company still to was that equity when we're no longer contributing, and it's not fair to the person who needs to step aside for a while or permanently. It's not fair to them either, to say, well, you get nothing for all the time you put into that company. So a vesting schedule allows us to have some elasticity as founders, and for me to say to you, look, I want to take the next month off. I haven't had a vacation in 5 years. I understand that my vesting is going to freeze while I'm away, and that's a sacrifice that is fair for me and for the company.
Absolutely. Something we were talking about before we turned the mic on was conversion funnels. So whether that's trying to get corporate partners or customers or enterprise clients or even investors on. Can you kind of share a little bit about what conversion funnel thinking is kind of about and how that works?
Yeah, so one of the common traits in startup entrepreneurs is our optimism and our self-confidence and our belief in what it is that we're doing. We're all little evangelists, and evangelism is part of my job title at Blue Chilli. And the problem with that approach is we consistently underestimate how hard everything is going to be to do. We think it's going to take less time than it ever does, and we usually end up in a very different place 6 or 12 or 18 months later. And so it can help to get used to the idea of passing everything through a conversion funnel. So if I need to get 5 investors to write a $200,000 check each, it's very common for a startup founder to go, okay, I'm going to go and pitch to 5, and I'll get 100% agreement, or maybe I'll pitch to 6. When in reality, it's probably going to take in Australia, 15 or 20. Elsewhere, it might take 40 or 50 organisations to take a really good hard look at what we're doing before we're able to get 5 investors to commit. It's probably also going to take much more than a lightweight pitch, a serious pitch, a board meeting, and a term sheet. Again, particularly in Australia, it's probably going to take 6 or 8 meetings over time. So if my aim is to raise capital over the next 6 months, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to need to have 3 meetings with 5 investors and then I'm done. It's a very different proposition, a much more realistic proposition if I say I'm probably going to need to have 60 coffees with an early group of maybe 20 or 30 potential investors. Then in the progress of those 60 coffees, I'm probably going to get down to a list of maybe 12 or 15, and then I'm going to narrow that 15 down to the final 6 or 7, and then of those final 6 or 7, one will be the lead investor and help me corral the remainder in. And that's probably going to take me 9 or 12 months when I look at it that way. I also start to realise I'm going to keep track of all the communication going on, both the emails and the meetings and the outcomes of those meetings. I'm going to need help with managing all that contact information, all of the proceedings of those meetings, and probably also the following up. Following up matters enormously in the startup industry. It's another thing that Australian startup founders fail to appreciate the importance of. Right, so just get started from day one and employ a CRM, because you just can't keep that stuff in your head or on a pad or in Word docs, and especially not in a Google sheet or an Excel spreadsheet. It just doesn't scale.
Absolutely. In terms of getting feedback and having those conversations, whether they're with investors or potential customers, how do you, I've seen it so many times with startups that either they're pitching, so that there's 2 ways: either you're pitching to the wrong person, who investor specifically or customer wise they don't have the problem that you're aiming to solve, or they're not. The business itself isn't something that is going to succeed based on what sort of experience and things like that people have. So how do startup founders gauge whether the feedback that they're getting from customers, negative feedback, is just because they're talking to the wrong customer, or because the problem that they're solving doesn't add the value that they thought that it actually solved?
Look, I don't think I really know. I don't think I really know how you solve that problem. There are things in the startup entrepreneur's life that have to be driven by gut instinct at the end of the day, and it's really good that on occasion you'll have instinctive consensus across the team. Other times you'll debate it again and again and again for the longest period of time. But successful startup founders develop an accurate gut instinct in time, and that's really the only way forward, because you don't have the capital or the time to do meticulous customer research. I have a tweet on Twitter pinned there at the moment, which says there are two kinds of people in startups. Type A, people who are comfortable with incomplete data. And that's it, right?
That's it.
Like you will never have enough information even in mid to late stage startups. You'll never have enough information to make, this is an empirical decision. To a greater or lesser extent, it will always be informed by the gut instinct of the founders. Sometimes by competitor behaviour, so you'll see a direct competitor to you suddenly pivot and start looking like they're solving a different problem for the same customer, or perhaps the same problem but for a different customer, and sometimes you can learn from that competitive analysis. Other times you look for correlations in customer feedback, so we're not just hearing this from 3 customers, we're hearing it from 7, right? So I was sat down with the founders of Ep025 this morning, and they were telling me that a feature that they thought one day they should probably add to their product that they've had in their backlog, they're consistently hearing again and again and again from customers is something that customers really want to see now. And so their current hypothesis is, look, let's deprioritize a couple of other things so that we can bring that further forward in the feature set. And at the end of the day, they still won't really know until that's deployed and out there with paying customers. But they are informed by their gut instinct at the end of the day.
Sure. And so you mentioned, sometimes it's just a timing thing, and you need to go through that process to develop a better gut instinct when it comes to those sort of things. Some of the private discussions that I've had with other investors and other people in the ecosystem is really looking at ways that we can encourage founders to stick around after they've had a failure. What in your mind sort of will help ecosystem-wise in helping founders that haven't been successful in their first or second or third try to keep them in there and not take the learnings that they've done from those failures and go into corporate space or apply into something else?
Really good question. I think one of the systemic problems with the current development of the Australian tech startup community is we have too much emphasis on being a founder and not enough emphasis on being an early stage startup employee. When you go to Silicon Valley, there's a much higher ratio of people working for startups versus being a startup founder themselves. I guess it comes back to me. I've had the same financial advisor since the early 90s, and when some of my early bets paid off and I had some capital to experiment with some new things, I started a record label, for instance, despite his advice. But I also wanted to start a cafe or a restaurant. I thought this is something I could express myself through my interior design and menus, blah, blah, blah. And he said, look, Alan, do me a favor. Before you almost certainly fail at that, go and work for somebody else who owns a successful restaurant or bar. Learn everything you can from them. You'll get paid a little bit of a salary. You'll have some great times, you'll have some hard times. But then you'll really know what it takes to be successful in that category of business, and somebody will have paid you to do it, So I think too many of us spend too much time thinking about being, the next startup that I'm going to found or co-found. I think if you want to be a successful long-term startup founder, I think you can learn a lot more quickly by being a great early employee in somebody else's startup. So I would say, if you fail as a founder, consider whether you might need to spend a couple of years as an early stage employee in somebody else's startup. Make some of the money back that you've lost by being, a zero salary early founder, and make some more connections, learn some new skills, and get paid a salary to do it.
Absolutely. And I guess sort of looking at the ecosystem as a whole, a recent announcement that you made was the She Starts program as well, which is really exciting. Can you kind of, for our listeners, talk a little bit about that, what you've just set up?
So it's no secret that gender diversity is a significant problem in the tech startup industry. There's way too many white men, and so there's gender diversity, there's racial diversity, there's also age diversity issues. But the first problem that we're trying to make a difference in is gender diversity in the Australian startup community. It's true that there are far too many capable women founders out there who don't define themselves as founders because they are held back from access to the kinds of advice and services and capital, the time required to take a founder's journey. And it's just, with my investor hat on, it just makes sense to have a portfolio of startup founded by a range of people that have an accurate, have a similar diversity makeup as the population as a whole, because that's the only way you know for sure that you're backing the best possible ideas. You shouldn't be backing the best possible ideas amongst the small subset of people who've been able to get the backing they need to move forward. You should be backing all the great ideas no matter where they come from. So in so many ways, the Australian startup community has made tremendous gains since I got started in 1997. It's an unrecognisable industry, and it's many, many times better and many, many times bigger than it is. And the Australian startup industry in that time has made tremendous progress in adding more gender diversity. So there is an organic rate of change in the number of women in the startup industry in Australia. But for many of us, that's not fast enough rate. And so we think we can hack that. And we are the industry which hacks things, right? So our She Starts Accelerator program is a way to hack that. So we're looking for a small group of women that don't currently consider themselves a startup founder, but they have an idea for a startup. And we want to work with them from that idea stage onwards, which is unusual. So most accelerator programs typically require you to have a prototype product and maybe some early customer traction and certainly a team, and but the She Starts program is for people who are at the idea stage primarily, and we're looking for female founded or female led startup companies. So you might have a team of 2 or 3 or 4 perhaps, so perhaps you've progressed on a little bit further from idea stage, but we're looking for female founded businesses so that we can hack that diversity problem from get-go. If we take that small number of female founded businesses and we improve the average success rate in that small group of companies, then we'll have achieved something of real value, but we won't have made nearly as big enough difference. And so what we also really want to do in part of this program is take those founders and take those companies to Silicon Valley to learn more about how Silicon Valley creates companies like this. And then at the end of the program, when they have a successful business, when we've helped them raise capital, when we've helped them find customers, and they now have a growing and sustainable tech startup business, we're going to take them around Australia and have them speak to many, many more female founders or potential female founders. So in high schools and universities and co-working spaces and incubators, and see if we can get from a handful of female founders to a couple of hundred female founders in the space of a couple of years. We can't do that alone, and so we've been tremendously fortunate to partner with some awesome organisations behind this. And so the 3 primary partners in the program are Sun Super, ANZ Bank and MYOB. Each of those organisations is trying to address gender diversity both in the customer base that they service and in their own organisations. And so this helps them hit their gender diversity goals. And it also gives them an opportunity potentially to get up close and personal with some startups that might be solving interesting problems in the industries which they face, in small business lending, for instance, or in home loan mortgages, or in software as a service accounting platforms, or in superannuation.
Sure. And so for anyone that's interested in getting involved, what's the best way for them to apply?
Shestarts.com.au has a brief but accurate and detailed introduction to the program. We've been open for applications now for about 18 hours, and we have a few hundred applications. I would expect we'll probably receive about 500 or 600. So I would say to people who think they might have an idea for a startup, don't spend too much time sweating about what the application should include and whether or not you should apply. Deciding whether or not to take a place in the program is a really good problem to have, but you won't get that problem unless you apply. So I would say get an application in now. Odds are you won't be successful, but you know what? the next application you put in next year will be better than the one you put in this year. But nothing begins until you put that first application in.
So, and finally, as an investor, so obviously you're kind of hacking the gender diversity space, but what else would you like to see more of in the ecosystem?
Diversity of all kinds. So there's a slight advantage there if you're somebody who's slightly nerdy from a subcontinent racial background, for instance. Okay, so it's okay to be an Indian or a Pakistani engineer, right, or the child of first generation migrants to Australia, and obviously there's everybody believes that startup founders. Ideal startup founders between 25 and 30 and look just like Mark Zuckerberg. So I would like to see greater age diversity and greater ethnic diversity in startup founders, and I would like to see a transition from the current industry hypothesis, which is in order to be a successful startup founder, you need to already be working in an engineering role in a technology company. I'd like to see us move towards the concept of great entrepreneurs can build a business in any kind of industry when they understand the problem that they're solving and the customer for whom they're solving it. So I would like to see a much greater growth in people coming to the startup industry as an entrepreneur from other industries. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that now, right? So, Blue Chilli, our current goal is to have a portfolio valuation of $1 billion by the end of 2020. I'm confident we're going to smash that goal. But when we get to that point, we will have a portfolio probably of 250, 300 startups, maybe 350 at that stage. They are just not all going to come from ex-Google and Facebook employees. The majority of those will be people from accounting, from legal, from finance, from a small business, from catering, and all they'll have in common is they're learning really fast about what works and what doesn't when they're solving a problem that they understand for a customer that they understand it for. You interviewed Sam Wong just the other day, who's had a tremendously successful ride over the last couple of years. 3 years ago, she was a lawyer. What is she now? She's one of Australia's best respected early stage venture capitalists. And that's really possible for many, many more people than Sam.
Absolutely. Alan, thank you so much for your time and for your insights today. That's been tremendously insightful. For anyone that wants to get in touch, follow your story, find out more, what's the best way for them to do that?
I've been using the same internet handle for everything I do for since 1998, I think it was. And so my internet handle is BIGYAHU, Big Yahoo. And so just Google that and you'll find me. Blue Chilli is at bluechilli.com, Startmate is at startmate.com.au. Check those both out.
Fantastic. I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Alan, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rohit.
Fantastic. Thanks for listening to episode 25 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Alan, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. On the 16th of November, I will be doing a live podcast interview with Brett Adam, the Managing Director and VP of Engineering at Zendesk. Brett has over 25 years of experience in the software industry with a background that includes CEO and CTO level positions in both public and private companies. If you're in Melbourne and free on the 16th of November, come down to the Zendesk offices on 67 Queen Street in the Melbourne CBD at 6 p.m. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 26 next week.